This is Defoliatry. Defoliatry is probably closer to the way that most duplicate file detectors that you'll find are, which is that you tell them a set of locations in which they're to find duplicate files, and they will find them, and then it will do things with them. So here we have a box that can hold a list of paths, and we can go and put some paths in there. The way the list selection works is I just use the browse button on the right to go and find a location. That then gets put in the path up the top, and I can then add it to the list. And doing that, we can build up a list of paths that we would like to run across. There are protections to stop you from choosing one that is a subfolder of another. So if I choose this one, which is a subfolder of where we just were, and try to do add to list, I will get a dialog telling me that I can't do that. If I really wanted to do that anyway, I can turn off check as added, which is below the list, and in which case now if I do add to the list, it will let me. I will find that if I go to run the process, it will check for a clash first, and it will refuse to run if there is a clash. I can check if I've got a clash now by clicking on check clashes, and not surprisingly, yes, there is a clash. And in this case, I could resolve that by deleting the parent folder that I put in, and there's a remove button down below. Takes that out, check clashes, all good. There's now no clashes in the list. I'll turn check as added back on. So we can add a whole bunch of folders here. Let's go and choose something else from a slightly different part of the There we go, that's another folder. So below the management of the list, we have various settings for how Defoliatry will operate. The first thing is, how do we detect what are the groups of files that are the same? So Defoliatry's purpose is to find duplicate files. What is it that makes those files duplicate according to how we want to search things? This may seem a bit unobvious, surely files are either the same or they're not the same, but actually there are circumstances where you would like to treat files as the same depending on what your needs are. There's a setting here for ignoring zero length files because frankly, obviously those are all the same regardless of their name or file stamp. As one zero length file is the same as another zero length file. It's really just a name entry in the file system. By default this was turned on, so normally we would ignore all of those. But if you actually did want to use Defoliatry to find those and therefore have it delete those, you can turn that back off so that it would in fact treat all the zero length files as being somewhat the same depending on the other settings we've got here. On the far right of this line we have 4 controls for what parts of files would we treat them as the same if that's what we were testing on. Going backwards from the right hand side, we've got the timestamp, the when of the file, we've got the name of the file, we've got the size of the file, and then we've got the content of the file, although here we're only testing it by the hash. We would calculate a hash from the file content and compare those to see if they're the same. Now as I've been clicking those on and off, you may see that a value has been changing in the left side. So this pull down box here is actually just a convenient way to select combinations of those 4, sort of in a descriptive sense. So if you wanted to check for just the content hash and that the timestamp was the same, well that's interesting, oh yes, that's right, then that will set just those. Now I said just those, but you may notice it sets size as well. That's because the logic of checking that 2 files have the same content is that it's meaningless to talk about 2 files as having the exact same content if they're different sizes. So anytime you select content hashing, it will turn size checking off. So there I've manually turned off hashing. If I now turn off size, when I click content hashing back on, it automatically switched on size. And the way I've programmed this is as you change the values on the right hand side, if there's a matching pull down entry, it'll show that as being the current one. It doesn't cover all possibilities, so it's not particularly hard, I think, to get some combination. Can I do this? Yes, that it doesn't know about, and it shows custom combination because I didn't have any single entry for combination of size and timestamp being the same. Which would be a curious combination. That means you were wanting to treat files as the same, even though they might have different names, and even though the contents of the files might be slightly different, even though they're the same size and have the same timestamp. I'm sure there might be some circumstances where that is what you might want to do. Defoliatry will therefore find sets of files that, for the reasons you've given, it thinks they're the same. Within those sets of files that are the same, you get to control which of those files will... Oh, no, that's not right. After it has found all of these sets of same files, the first thing you want to be able to tell it is which of those sets should it go treating first. In other words, looking to delete. The default setting here is largest first because it's somewhat assumed that you're probably doing this to reduce storage space being used by all the files. You're probably trying to find duplicate files to clear up space, in which case the most useful thing to do is, of all of those, assuming it checked the size of those, is delete from the largest set of duplicates first. Very hard to talk about this. The large file size set first. Now, depending on what you have set in your combinations for what makes things being the same, your idea of the order in which to choose which set to get rid of may not make any sense. At the moment, largest first is fine because size is one of the selections. But if I turn off size, you'll note that even though largest first hasn't changed, a red indicator comes up to tell you that that is not viable with your current mode checkboxes. That's because if you haven't collected size as part of your process for deciding what's the same, at the moment we've got the setting of just for things that have the same timestamp, down to the second basically, then it's got no way of choosing which of those is the largest because it didn't collect that information. So this is a bit constraining, I guess, but certainly at the moment the group deletion order can only be done on something you have collected. If you change that to... actually, I can't see it on the list here. It's gone off screen. That's not very good. That's interesting. To newest first, because when is what's related to whether files are old or new, that means that that is viable as a selection. The group deletion box does not change automatically to one that is viable. It merely tells you that the setting that you've got is not viable. In the end, I had to decide to some extent which way to control which things affect which other things. I decided that you should be free to change these as you like, these checkboxes, and merely get told whether what you've got in the deletion order is viable or not. I could have had it automatically change, but I decided I didn't want that. Within each group, so these are where you've got a group of files that it's been decided are the same, there is the question of which of those should you delete. This is particularly important for when you're doing something like choosing on content, size and name, but you've got multiple copies of the file and maybe they're from different times. You've downloaded a file at different times, for example. We'll just change that back to largest first to get the red mark away. There is a question of which of those should you delete. Which do you want to keep and which should you delete? The default setting is get rid of all of them but leave the one that you had first downloaded it, if you like. So all but the oldest is the default mode, but you can have other values for that. Finally, The last line of this is about actually doing the deletions from having found your sets that are the same. You may or may not have proven that these files are the same as part of your process of detecting that they're the same. This is mainly because you could turn off content hashing, but have size, like you could have this size, name and when, very likely to be exactly the same file, but you didn't check them for content hash as you were detecting. You would do this because this would be a very fast way to do things, because you didn't have to read the contents of the files as you were finding which ones are the same. But now as you go to delete them, you want to be sure it's exactly the same content, so you could choose do congruent before each delete. The name congruent comes from the name of one of the other tabs, where we have a whole setting for just testing things are being the same. And in particular, if we choose do stringent congruent, that will do a byte for byte comparison of at least one of the file that's been chosen to not be deleted and the one that is currently being chosen to be deleted. Finally, there's how shall we actually do the deletion of a file. We can by default generate a bash script, which you can then inspect and then run manually to delete all the files that it found could be safely deleted, or you can actually tell it to directly delete itself, in which case it will do that. And finally, when all that's ready and to go, you click on Run Process and away it goes.